My name is Asim Chandra. I am your host for this podcast series called Rev Signal, where we look for a revenue signal in your data. We have a really interesting guest and story to share with you today. My guest today is Rayees Pasha from RisingWave Labs. He heads a product for RisingWave. Hi, Rayees. How are you?
I'm doing well, Asim. Thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. Thanks for joining us. And we've been talking a lot about product data in the context of traditional SaaS tools. We have the opportunity today to actually talk about it in the context of open source products. So, how do you leverage product data in the context of an open source product? So the title today is From Open Source to Cloud: Harnessing Product Data for Driving Growth. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we love to have you ask us questions throughout the show. So please feel free to jump in and share your questions on the chat pod as part of the webinar, and we'll raise that to our guests. And at any time, feel free to jump in and raise your hand if you'd like to participate in the webinar and ask your questions directly. All right, so let's get right to it. So Rayees, take a moment to introduce yourself and your background, your role at RisingWave as well as prior to that.
Sure. So hello, everyone. My name is Rayees Pasha. I head the product team at RisingWave Labs. RisingWave Labs is a fairly young company. We've been in existence for 2.5 years. We are building a stream database. A streaming database, as the name suggests, is basically amalgamation of stream processing capability with database functionality put together in one solution. So we are an open source product. Our origin is as an open source product, and we have built a SaaS service on top called RisingWave Cloud, which we announced GA quite recently. So this discussion is very pertinent and timely in my mind, because we're going through the exact go-to-market motion at this point of how to pivot in our moorings as an open source product to more like a commercial SaaS offering. A little bit of background on my previous career. I started out as an engineer, system side engineer of the database management side, worked on cost optimizations, cardinality estimation, and more the internals of a database optimizer. And then I moved to product management halfway through my career as a PM for almost all of my time has been in the data domain, like either for a database management company or as a cloud database data platform companies, both small and large. Last 3 companies have been startups, and I feel like startups have the energy and the pace that I really look forward to, and I'm looking forward to this discussion with the team. And actually invite all of you to submit questions or ask questions, because I feel like engendering a discussion is probably the best way to address these open-ended questions that we want to tackle in this webinar.
Great. Thank you, Rayees, and thank you for that introduction. So could you take a quick moment to, I know you talked a little bit about RisingWave as a streaming database for streaming data, but maybe talk a little bit about what do we mean by streaming data? How is it different from other kinds of databases and the modern data stack, and what does it fit in that context?
Sure. So streaming so far has been seen in the context of ingestion, right? You know Kafka, you know Pulsar, you know Kinesis, all the services that have come on board in the last 1 decade to ease the path for disparate data sources to bring in the data to your database or whatever your processing layer is. And then the rest of this pipeline, so to speak, for the data pipeline has been the traditional batch pipeline. What RisingWave wants to do is change that. Basically, bring the same real-time nature that was brought to ingestion aspect to the processing aspect as well, so that you don't have to wait for the data to be stored in a database and then processed and then prepare it for serving. The latency that it requires for the hybrid model, where you have the ingestion coming in real time, but the processing happening in batch, doesn't serve well for a lot of use cases that we see. And this is evident in not just the new use cases that require ultra low latency, but also the traditional use cases. People are moving more and more to real time in terms of fraud detection, in terms of IoT, with the widespread use of 5G, where we see a lot of the processing going to the edge as opposed to core. We feel like the processing also needs to be in near real time. And that's what we're trying to provide. Now, what's different about RisingWave Labs is that we are bringing the SQL-based development model. Because some of the systems, the first generation stream processing systems, introduced new APIs. So there was a lot of learning curve for the users to adopt stream processing. In our case, we said we'll provide the same functionality, but with the ease of a SQL-like high-level declarative language, so that we can tap into literally millions of SQL developers who could just write SQL code and can still be able to build real-time applications. So you obviously, please go to RisingWave Labs and to learn more about what our API looks like and what use cases we support and how we compare against other stream processing platforms.
Perfect. Awesome. And you started out as an open source project, and then of course, RisingWave Labs came about a little bit later. So tell me a little bit about the open source adoption and what does that look like? How many users are out there? How many downloads? Just so that the audience has a sense for the scale of what you guys are doing.
Yeah, the first year of our existence, we were in stealth mode. The challenge was to build this, because RisingWave as a system is a built from scratch. It's a native streaming ingestion system. We did not take an existing open source platform and did a bolt-on implementation or something like that. We did from the scratch. So the first whole year was building something, and then we open sourced the project in April of 2022 as an Apache 2 license. And from that, we've been seeing adoption in terms of the downloads, in terms of how often our public repo has been forked. And in terms of the download, the number is, varies depending on what version, because we have monthly versions released. So it runs into basically thousands of downloads. And I think the key metric is more actually how many live clusters are running our software, because we do have backend hooks to collect the telemetry, anonymous telemetry on who's deploying our software and what they're doing and all that. And there we see literally hundreds of users using for different purposes, for education, for pre-prod, and even production level use by different companies all over all geos. So from that perspective, our adoption curve, we have dashboards that track month over month or quarter over quarter. We've been progressing in a really healthy growth we see. And I think we, in the last 9 months, when we embarked on this journey to build the SaaS service, it was with the assurance that we have enough traction in the market, that we have early adopters who are able to give us the signal that there is value in our product, so we could make the push from having table stakes to actually make it enterprise ready for our customers.
Great. So I think, in the sense of that, RisingWave is the open source project, and RisingWave Labs is essentially the SaaS service to provide that to enterprise customers, and so that seems like a pretty traditional model in terms of how companies evolve around open source products. But how do you find the right balance between promoting the open source project and then obviously monetizing that through your hosted then managed infrastructure? Maybe talk a little bit about where the company invests resources and how do you balance between those two areas?
Great question, because we both have different way of operating, right? The open source project is a project for the community of users. So it has a development model different from the commercial offering SaaS, which is like a product, right? We do have product managers for both who kind of run the roadmap, but the roadmap of how we develop for one versus that is quite different. On the former, it is more through engagement community. We see where the need is. We provide disproportionate amount of time in terms of what features we work on, and also it's a different mindset. It's like, as we build, the updates come in. It's on the right. On the other hand, on the SaaS service, it is it caters to the needs of our early adopters. So they have a disproportionate amount of influence on what we have done in that perspective. And our cadence in terms of release is also different. With the SaaS service, we have much faster turnaround time. Every 2 weeks we have a release, and we have hot patches and all that. With the open source side, it's much different. We take a longer view of things, in terms, like I said, monthly release, and it's a different cadence. Now, in terms of the go-to-market perspective, on this, we don't see a conflict between the two, right? Because open source for us is more like the open source community users are a potential customers, but at the same time, we don't tend to be too salesy with them. We don't go and try to convert them explicitly. It's more like we want them to come in. They're a potential inbound channel for us. So when they come in with a pain point, usually there are 2 or 3 hooks we have in terms of where we can find them to engage with them, and an opportunity to transition them from being an open source user to a commercial user, which typically happens either if they're looking for a product extension for something that the community in general at large may not want, but they want something specific. That is something that we engage with them. Or if they're looking for production level support, right? They don't have the resources on their own. They would like us to be the one. And since we're not doing enterprise support business, we're doing more managed service. So that's another point where we bring in and say, okay, this is what we have. And then also some may have other needs in terms of they're already part of a data infra and they're like a connector. There's something where they want to embed our engine. So those are some of the avenues through which we divert or at least nudge our open source users towards our commercial offerings.
Got it. Got it. Very cool. Now, we talked in the past a little bit about some of the challenges with capturing product telemetry for an open source product that a user can download and deploy in their own cluster and so on, versus something that they might turn to you for hosted or managed infrastructure services. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what kind of product telemetry do you capture on the open source product? And let's start there perhaps. And then what are some of the constraints you're looking to balance for? Because obviously, like, you don't want to push it too far from a data privacy standpoint as well.
That's correct. So we have 2 levels of information. So when someone initially downloads our software, or they do for a repo, or even request our Docker image, for example, we collect some basic information about the user. It's voluntary, obviously, but there is some information that's required, like email, things like that, so we can communicate with that user for updates and things like that. And this is, we are able to at least identify the user to a certain extent. And the reason it's important is because when the same user communicate with us in various channels, like either through our website, when they're communicating, we're able to at least create some sort of user journey of what the user has been in contact with. Like, have they tried their product? Have they looked at our content? Have they attended a webinar? Some sort of a user journey we want to do. That's one information. But more pertinent to your question about product usage data, we have backend telemetry that collects information like system resource usage, what OS version are they running on, how long the system has been running, what is the size of their cluster, what geo they belong to. So a lot of the metadata, I would say, because like you rightly said, this is all anonymous. We can never identify what company uses, and this is the opt-in model. They can always, they can turn it off using a configuration setting. So we put it right up front that this information is being collected. And if they don't want it, that's fine. So this is the information we collect. This gives us a good sense of what versions are most commonly deployed, what is the right amount of, what is the time, in terms of cluster uptime that we are seeing, where if there's drop off happening after a certain point, is it pointing to lack of stability in the product, things like that we want to glean. We get that information from this telemetry data.
Got it. And what I'm curious, like, what percentage of users opt out of the data collection piece?
Very few, actually, to be honest. At least from what we can tell. It's probably because a lot of them are trying, so they don't care. But I think when they go to production, some of them are more sensitive about turning off this. So one thing I wanted to clarify on that, I mentioned about data that we collected. I want also we make sure that what we don't collect is also upfront. We don't collect anything about their data catalog, like what object, like actual data that they have. It is completely, encrypted. We do not have any access to their data plane.
Yeah.
This is all on the control plane that we're able to get information.
Got it. Makes sense. And the other sort of obviously natural question is that once you're collecting this data, how are you thinking about the data and utilizing it to improve the service, improve the product, improve the experience that the user has in interacting with RisingWave Labs? So maybe talk a little bit about what happens to the data after you collect it.
So on the open source side, it is more our own analysis. Since we cannot reach out to them directly, we can only send product updates. If we make the connection between the original sign up who downloaded and we're able to identify, if they reach out to us, obviously through our community Slack channel, then we can say, okay, you have this version. We know of these issues. This is the patch, hot patch, and things like that. That are more product updates we can provide them. And then also we can, if they reach out to us, if they want to take a diagnostic on a particular issue they're seeing, we can provide proactive support. Those are the things we can do on the support side. On our side, in terms of the roadmap itself, we're able to see what are the most requested connectors, for example, that we haven't covered in our roadmap. That kind of helps us prioritize on what we should focus on. And these are some of the things. Now, one thing I also want to highlight is that the data that we get is not complete on the open source side. Like on the SaaS side, we get product analytics data that's much more complete. On the open source side, because of the network bandwidth, the telemetry data may not be complete. So we cannot get a holistic view of the all install base, like hundreds of clusters that are running. The information we get is only partial because of various reasons, because some clusters go away, so we don't really get their information. And sometimes they may have changed config settings halfway through the deployment, which means we get only partial data. So there's a number of issues. So we tend to treat it with some sense of like, okay, we cannot treat this as gospel truth, as opposed to on the SaaS service, we have complete control, and the telemetry where we collect there is a lot more complete.
Got it. Makes sense. And let's maybe shift gears and talk about the SaaS side, since you've alluded to a couple of times, like what additional insights you're able to capture on product usage, product consumption, engagement, et cetera, on the SaaS side.
Yeah. So on the SaaS side, we have both, obviously, the usage data, the raw usage data of how much computer resources, what the users are using versus the engagement aspect as well, right? Like how engaged are they? What are they able to accomplish from a service perspective? And on the usage side, we can tell obviously all the vital metrics like how long the computer has been running, what is the high watermark of the memory usage, what are they using on the storage side, just the regular utilization. And also, we also try to have it done by persona, right? Where the two critical personas we address on the SaaS side. One is the developers themselves who use our platform to build applications. And then you have the operation staff, like even though we are a managed service, there is still some operational tasks that a ops guy or ops person has to do. So though on the former, we collect metrics like how many jobs they ran, like for example, how many reports they generated, so that they can see what is the time it takes to run, average time for a report to generate, average job, and how much memory is consumed, and things like that. So that for a developer, they can better plan their workflows. For the ops side, we can provide more cost estimates, like what is the estimate that how long was the service up on a daily basis, which is the most expensive job. I mean, someone has written a bad query, right? For example, so they can go back and look at like, okay, maybe I don't need to spend this kind of money because obviously on the business side doesn't make sense, right? So those kind of metrics we provide, and this is provided by tenant specific at tenant level. The customer may have multiple tenants running multiple use cases, so we're able to slice and dice at a tenant level and even at the user level, the same basic metrics we have at this point.
Got it. And Rayees, how are those data points that you're collecting, both for the SaaS service as well as for the open source product, how are those being utilized? Like, who are the different consumers inside your company, and what do they look for in that data?
So one is the product team itself.
Yep.
Because when we look at the on the SaaS side, the utilization of service in terms of the like for example, the service that we have in terms of different. We have a basic model at this point, T-shirt size model of what instance types we provide, right? Are they the right sizes? Are we providing? Are we seeing a lot of drift where someone starts somewhere and we're not able to be? Are we grander enough? That's one thing. We try to do all the check all the time, right? Because for us, we are elastic scaling service, so you can start small and go up. But is it granular enough? That's one thing. The second thing is on the jobs themselves. Like for example, on our SRE side, we need to know what is the job failure rate, what is the completion rate, job failure rate, and also a deeper dive into the logs to see what the main cause of failures. For example, is it a developer error, like a operator error, or is it more like the system itself has some issues? And even when there is a failure, what sort of response are we communicating? What is the notification pattern to the end user? So all these things are where we are, because we are fairly early in our journey, right? The way I see it is the product analytics. There's almost like in our roadmap, we have a 4-level ways how we are going to unveil these product analytics. What we have is mostly immediate product usage data that we are able to show now. The second one is more comprehensive look at entire tenant and not just at a for a customer across tenants we can cumulatively provide. Third is more advanced product analytics data that where we can go deeper into query profiling, for example, workload profiling. So we can just, instead of saying yes or no, whether it failed, passed, we can actually provide insight for a user to say, what did they do wrong? How could they, in an automated fashion, without us having a live debugging session, or because it won't scale for us as we go and have more customers. So that level of intelligence will come in 3. And then the last one I see is more cohort analysis. Like for example, if you have multiple customers from a product usage data, A versus B, both are, how are they different? How are they same? Why is this customer A is doing much better in terms of customer satisfaction versus either? So that level of benchmarking that will come. So I feel like it's a gradual maturing of the service. As the service matures and the product analytics and the usage data that we collect will also mature over time.
Got it. And so I think the product side of it as a consumer, product team as a consumer of all of this analytics is obviously almost every company that is producing B2B software does that. How do you think about making that data available to your consumable for your go-to-market teams? And I know that you recently got on GA with your SaaS product, and I assume there is a pricing model associated with that. There's probably some self-onboarding or PLG kind of motion. So can you talk a little bit more about that? And what does that model look like? And then second, how does the data, the product insights actually help, product usage insights actually help from a go-to-market standpoint?
A great question, actually. The product usage data right now, when we build the service, it was more organic service that we built in the product itself. We didn't integrate into MarTech any of the tooling, and we want to do that next, right? And we have an internal app that kind of collects and all this information stored in a separate database. So for a go-to-market person, we have dashboards. They can go and look at, like, for example, what are the number of new signups, new clusters, what is the size of the cluster, what is how long have they been running? So they can get this basic trend analysis. And if there is someone who's running beyond a free trial period, for example, what are the touch points that we can have? Like, for example, if someone started 1 week, who are the new ones, and what is the level of activity? And if there's suddenly we don't see anything happening on the cluster after a few days, the go-to-market team can see, okay, these guys, maybe a quick email to see what are they stuck on. Are they just not interested, or why did they sign up, right? So those kind of insights at a high level are there through the internal app that we have built, but this is not integrated at this point with any of the tooling like HubSpot or any of the MarTech tooling on their side.
Got it. So how does the growth team or the sales team sort of get those insights delivered to them? Because you mentioned they're not, that it's not currently integrated into Salesforce or HubSpot. So what's sort of the mechanism by which they get alerted? And I assume, there's thousands of open source users, so there's probably a lot of data to look through.
Yeah, so we have email notification service from the app. So they get, like, you can subscribe to that notification, and you can specify what exactly you want notified on the actual prospect, on a particular event. For example, for every sign up, that's probably going to be too much for anyone, but we get you can do a daily digest, or you can daily on the sign up, or when the cluster is up, or when someone has finished their trial. So all these events, we are able to provide notification through email. But more likely what our team does is log on to the app and look at it, review it themselves. So it's been more that model as opposed to the notification model. And we are, like I said, we are still at the stage we are in, we are able to manage it. But going forward, we would obviously love to integrate it more into their natural tooling, right? Because go-to-market, the sales team, they're more comfortable dealing with Salesforce, dealing with HubSpot, as opposed to an internal app that was built purely for engineering purposes.
Got it. Makes sense. Okay, so in terms of what are some of the challenges that you've experienced in either data collection or data management or generating insights out of it from the product telemetry data that you're currently collecting?
So in terms of the challenges, it's mostly it's mostly like I mentioned before, it's the incomplete data or missing data that has been the bigger challenge. Because once it's in the SaaS service in our side, once on our metric store, we're able to run and get the metrics, aggregates, whatever the key insight we want to get, we can get. It is the data collection and then transport, which is where some of the challenges have been on the open source side. On the SaaS side, I don't see any problem at all. It's just that we collect a ton of telemetry. It's just that we are not able to make sense of what we can do, right? Because for a lot of the metrics we start with a question. Because I ask my go-to-market team, what questions are you looking for? Where can I help you? And based on that questions, we go to the telemetry and say, okay, what sort of metric we can build to answer the question that the growth team had. So I think the challenge has been like, what are the pertinent questions that we want, that our sales team needs? And some of the questions have been very simple at this point, like we're scratching the surface, right? We have heard this, what are my signups in the last day? Or who has started a cluster? Who has run into some issue or whatever, who has opened a support ticket, for example. Those are the basic things we are dealing with at this point. But I'm sure as we mature and go to a lot more users and then customers, and then our server mature, there's going to be greater challenges ahead.
Got it. That makes sense. And I'm curious, as part of this process, I know when we last talked, you'd mentioned how you've gone about building some of this infrastructure yourself. But have you evaluated any third-party tools that can help with the ability to sort of take all of that product data and make it available and consumable for your go-to-market teams in particular? Are there any conversations you've had there, any insights you can share in terms of what you see in the market?
Yeah, great question. I've looked at a couple in my previous job, not so much here. Gainsight and Pendo and others on the product ops side, not just for analytics, but in general, how to bring the development and the SRE teams together so that to help with the support and the CS teams, how can they get a one single view? That way, they're not compartmentalized into looking at their own data. But at RisingWave Labs, we are not there yet. But I do feel like, and part of the reason why is it because these tools are probably an overkill for who our primary early adopters are, who are open source users. And we don't know their motivation in terms of how much they want to, some people be just dabbling and trying, learning. So that's why we made a conscious decision that onboarding a tool like that would be an overkill for that user base. But with the SaaS services ramping up, I think definitely it makes more sense, and we will look into integrating, looking at evaluating at least one of these tools.
Got it. Makes sense. Great. And in terms of now I'm gonna focus a little bit more on the go-to-market side, because obviously that is something that's with your GA, et cetera, probably going to become more important. So you talked about some of the questions that the team might ask, but are there specific metrics that you're developing with your GTM team that helps them understand the strength of the pipeline, or not like the overall pipeline, but just sort of like the open source conversion funnel? What does that look like? Any metrics in that area that you've discussed or you think might be important in the future?
So in terms of the metrics, we do have a scoring system with the funnel. Like, for example, for a raw lead going to the next phase, what are the things that we want from open source perspective? If it's an inbound lead, we come up with a scorecard that says they have to have done this. Like, for example, how active they are in our Slack community, in terms of their interaction with our repo, like have they forked data, they've done what meaningful action they've done, right? So, and then from that point onwards to our definition of MQL, like how do we define a particular lead to be MQL versus SQL, right? So we have our own standard process that we put together, and that's the funnel we go through in terms of how we qualify. And the input from it's a more two-way process, right? Like the growth team has, the go-to-market team has mentioned, like these are the things that make sense for us to consider a particular lead as a viable prospect. And the product team has said, okay, this is the information we can provide you. So it's been a more collaborative way where we have reached at the process, in terms of nurturing the funnel. Now, the specific metrics are, like I said, are a combination of what the product analytics data gives us, like in terms of what they run and what they've done with the product in a pure PLG mode. Versus the marketing aspect, like if the same individual has shown interest in terms of attending a webinar, open a content, has been, what have they done to engage with us, right? So it's a combination of both. It's not purely analytical data coming in from one side.
I get it. So Rayees, we've talked to, like from an Immersa perspective, obviously, like we talked to a number of companies who are both traditional SaaS as well as open source. Most of our customers currently are SaaS customers. But what we learned in the open source domain is that the conversion rate from the open source project to the the hosted offering or the managed offering is like typically, like I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, like some of the largest companies we've talked to is like under 1%. Like what metrics, like, or what levers do you think that companies in your position have to actually bring that up, right? Because there's thousands of downloads, but then when you actually look at the number of the customers that convert, that can be a small number. What are some of the dials that are available to actually improve that conversion rate?
Yeah, so the way we it's a great question because of the viability of the model itself, right? Like some of it is biased by the fact that the early open source businesses were built around support, like more so than going with the managed service. So in terms of how we are trying to address that is through more articulating the value on at a solution level, right? So we're not just talking about all about our product. We're trying to pivot towards what you can do with RisingWave as opposed to saying what is RisingWave, right? Initial phase, it did make sense to get the community jazzed up about like what new technology we're bringing, but we put less importance on the technical aspects as opposed to talking more about what use cases make sense and how easy it is to actually build it. Because even if you talk about the use cases, the ease of use and the cost of ownership are things that are not spoken with enough importance in our marketing, in our reach out. When we reach out to are early adopters, we emphasize the cost of ownership aspect quite upfront, and that's why that when I talk about the SQL developers being our core audience, it is with that meant in mind that this is not some truly unique technology that you will have to learn and it's like a rocket ship. It is your another regular database, but you can do extraordinary things. So that kind of helps some of our conversion, and we're able to connect to people. Now, the point about why would someone, it is true that if you go purely with a support model, if you are a big company with a deep pockets, they have less motivation to actually adopt a service like ours, right? Because if they have already invested, they have resources in terms of manpower and resources in terms of compute resources that they don't want to lean on something like RisingWave Labs to do it. Now, on the other hand, if you have a small shop, if you're a small company, you don't have resources, then even if they want our help, they won't be able to pay much. So in a way, the support model, that's why we decided against it completely and went with managed service, and managed service that scales. You can start small and scale as your business needs grow. And I think in the last few years, we've seen a number of data infra companies adopt that model, and I feel like that blueprint works for us as well.
Got it. Great. Awesome. And there's a question here from Lina about sharing recommendations with any orgs that are just starting to utilize product data. What's the best way to start? What's the best way to go about it? Any kind of a roadmap that you can share based on your own experience?
Yeah, so the roadmap we did at our place is, like I said, like we phased approach, right? We started with the basic immediate needs that you need, like, because when you build a SaaS service, you don't want to be blind where then you're no different than a regular software company where you ship CDs to someone and fend it for themselves and support it. So from that perspective, starting with the very basic information about user tenant information, what is the operational history of what they're doing with the service, historical metrics, both at the user tenant level. I think those are the things you need to start with, and then you can add more like once you have had a GA service billing, track the whatever more deeper analysis into each user, what they're running, so that it's more personalized history of what each one is doing. So you can associate cost of the service to a much more granular level. And then you can go a little bit deeper into, I'm talking more from the data domain perspective, workload profiling. You can do data analysis on the data movement, storage and things like that. That give a more advanced analysis on the product user side. And then the last one, I say more, which I call more explorative, are things that can help us overall health of the service, like for an analysis of different user of companies, cohort analysis, so to speak, of trying to see how we can compare and make recommendations. Like it's more like we go to the user, and rather than they discovering issues, we can tell them these are the recommendations we have for you to improve your experience with us, things like that. So it's more like a gradual roadmap you have to build. Just as you build roadmap for your product, you need to build one for product data and how you unveil that.
Awesome. Okay. Rayees, thank you so much for your time today. We're just at the mark where we're going to wrap up here. So to our audience who are joining us today, thank you for joining us. We'll pause here now. Rayees, if you don't mind staying on for a little bit longer, I'd really appreciate it. For anybody that wants to reach out to Rayees, what's the best way for them to find you if they have any questions afterwards and they're listening to this podcast later on, Rayees?
Let me leave my email address in the chat if you don't mind.
Yeah.
It's mrayees@gmail.com. I'll
Perfect.
be happy to answer any questions from your listeners.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We will share a recording of this podcast within 24 hours. And if you registered for us with us, and then please feel free to join us next week for a similarly exciting conversation on the user data, specifically product data to drive revenue. Thank you all for your time.